Welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Stephen Sackur. My guest today has made a unique contribution to our understanding of humankind's closest relatives, the primates, in particular the chimpanzee. Jane Goodall was in her 20s when she began her meticulous observation of chimpanzee behaviour in Africa. Now she's in her mid-80s, a world-famous conservation activist. So what hope is there for saving the primates and so many other species from mass extinction? Jane Goodall, welcome to Hard Talk.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to Hard Talk.
It is a pleasure having you on the program, and it strikes me this year is a rather remarkable anniversary for you. It is 60 years from the beginning of your work in what we now call Tanzania, your observation of the chimpanzees in the forest. When you consider the 60-year span of time, what is your overriding feeling when you reflect on what has happened in those 6 decades?
Well, the world has changed. There's no question. It's changed rather dramatically. When I first arrived at the Gombe, which now the Gombe National Park, it was part of the great equatorial forest belt that stretched from the western part of East Africa right across to the West African coast. And when I flew over Gombe National Park, which is very small, in 1990, I was shocked to see a tiny island of forest, and it was surrounded by completely bare hills, more people living there than the land could support, too poor to buy food from elsewhere. Chimpanzees now isolated from other remnant chimpanzee groups in the area, and right across Africa, chimpanzee numbers have dropped, forests have disappeared. There's the live animal trade, mothers shot to sell babies. The bushmeat trade, because in some African countries, people think chimp meat is a delicacy. So that is also adding to the depletion of chimpanzee numbers right across Africa.
Even in that answer, you've given us such a sense of the enormous environmental pressures that the chimpanzees have been under over those 60 years. And I want to go through this from the beginning. I want to start by having you take us back to 1960, to the young Jane Goodall in her 20s with no real scientific academic training, but certainly amazing gifts for natural observation. How unusual was it for you to be given the role, the responsibility of going out into the forest and undertaking this scientific observation?
Well, it was absolutely unique. You're right, I had no scientific training at all. I just did biology in school. I left school at 18. We didn't have money for a university or a college. And so when I arrived in Africa, it was simply because from the age of 10, I had dreamed of going to live with wild animals in Africa and write books about them. And I was fortunate to meet Dr. Louis Leakey, the famous paleontologist. And I think he was really impressed by how much I knew about African animals from the reading I'd done. You know, when I grew up, there was no TV, so it was reading. And so he offered me a job as his assistant, really. And then he became, I suppose, more impressed because he saw that I really had this thing about being with animals and watching them and could cope with the bush. And so he gave me this extraordinary opportunity. I mean, I would have studied any animal, and it was chimpanzees.
And interestingly, Louis Leakey, I think, encouraged you to run with this idea that meticulous observation of the chimpanzees might reveal new sort of connections between their behaviours and human behaviours. Is that something that when you went out into the forest you were actively looking for?
Well, I wasn't looking for it, but that's the reason. He sent me because he believed, as everybody does now, but he was ahead of his time. He believed there was a common ancestor, chimp-like, human-like, ape-like, human-like rather, about 6 million years ago, and because he was searching for the fossilized remains of our earliest human ancestors, he felt that if Jane sees behavior in chimpanzees today that's similar or maybe the same as behavior in humans today, maybe that behavior was also present in the common ancestor, brought with us on our two separate evolutionary pathways. And he felt that would give him, for the first time, some way of imagining how those early ancestors might have behaved.
You adopted techniques which I think we can now say were groundbreaking. You immersed yourself in the life of the chimp troop. I don't know if that's actually the right word, but the group of chimpanzees. You were with them every day. You encouraged them to get very confident in your presence, and you didn't observe them with sort of scientific detachment and give them numbers as so many scientists had done in the past. You engaged with them and related to them in a much more intimate way.
I certainly did. I observed them. It took a long time before they trusted me enough for me to really get close, but that's how I'd studied the animals around my home in Bournemouth all my life. So I knew, given time, that they would come to accept me. Did I have time? We only had money for 6 months, and they kept running away every time they saw me. But then finally, one of them, I named him David Greybeard, and he accepted me better than the others, and I saw him using and making tools to fish for termites. That was the turning point. That was when Leakey was able to bring in the National Geographic and send a photographer and filmmaker. And so gradually I was able to get to know the chimpanzees as individuals, each with their own personality. I could see their minds working to solve simple problems, and I could witness their emotions like happiness, sadness, fear, grief. And all of this, when I was sent by Leakey to Cambridge University to do a PhD in ethology, this is when the professors told me I'd done everything wrong. Yes, naming the chimps isn't scientific, and I shouldn't talk about them having personalities, minds, or emotions, because those, they said, were unique to humans. But even though I was nervous, never having been to college, I had been taught by a wonderful teacher as a child that this wasn't true, that in this respect these erudite professors were wrong. And that teacher is right here behind me. I hope you can see him. It's my dog Rusty. And you cannot spend meaningful time with any animal, a dog, a rat, a pig, a chimpanzee, and not know that we are not the only beings on the planet with personalities, minds, and emotions. And I was also told you mustn't have empathy with your subject. Scientific observation should be sort of remote and cold and objective. But this is absolute rubbish, because only when you have empathy, you see something you don't understand, and you just have this feeling as to why it's happening. And so then you can stand back as a scientist, which is what Cambridge taught me, and check whether your intuition is right or wrong.
Jane, as you say, National Geographic were very eager to send first a photographer, then a full camera crew to record what you were doing in the forest. And many films have been made over the years using material from that period, but there was some archive footage that wasn't seen for very many years, and it's all been pulled together now in an extraordinary film. We just want to play a little clip from the archive showing you increasingly winning the confidence of the chimpanzees in the forest. Let's have a look right now.
And gradually they allowed me to get closer and closer. was absolutely thrilling to have the chimpanzees so close.
What strikes me from that clip, Jane Goodall, is that there was a degree of real intervention in what you were doing. You were sort of laying bananas out increasingly close to yourself so you could get closer and closer to these creatures. Some may look at that and say that you were therefore interfering in a way that made their behaviours not entirely spontaneous and natural. Some have talked about the degree of aggression that you encouraged as they ended up fighting for bananas. Did you, at the time, worry about that degree of interference?
No, because, there was no protocols. There were one or two field studies of primates. They all had feeding stations, or almost all of them did. And what I was interested in right from the beginning was the behavior of the individual. That was also discouraged by the scientists. But all the chimpanzees I was learning about had the same kind of situation. So I wasn't so interested in what they actually might have done if I wasn't there. Admittedly, it did increase the aggression. And when I realized that, we stopped that feeding.
The key finding, and there were many, and we'll talk about several of them, but the key finding that still resonates through the world of primatology and animal behavioral science today was your observation, and it comes back to, I think, David Greybeard, the name you gave to one of the chimps, his use of a stick as a tool to capture termites and, of course, then to eat them. And it wasn't just the use of this tool, it was the shaping and modeling of the tool to make it as effective as possible as a collector of termites. When you observed this tool behavior, did it immediately strike you that this was something of a breakthrough?
Well, I knew it was a breakthrough. I knew that we were supposed to be the only tool-making animal on the planet. And it was Professor Osman Hill who defined us as man the toolmaker. So I knew it was a breakthrough as far as science was concerned. I knew that this was a breakthrough, and it really did change the whole course of the events, because David was carefully selecting grass stems, pushing them down into the termite hole, pulling them out slowly, eating off the termites. But he was also reaching out and picking a leafy twig, and to use that he had to carefully strip the leaves. That was the tool making. And of course now we know they make tools in other ways as well, but it was very exciting. However, if the scientists had bothered to go into the field and talk to, for example, the indigenous people living in the forest in Congo, they would have told them, well, of course chimpanzees use tools, we've seen it. Well, I actually believe, because chimpanzees are so like us biologically, that we share 98.6% of the composition of DNA and many other similarities in composition of blood, immune system, anatomy of the brain, and so on, along with Hugo's film of chimpanzee behavior, the similarity in nonverbal communication, kissing, embracing, holding hands, patting one another on the back, then it sort of forced science out of that very reductionist way of thinking about our relationship with animals.
I want to talk for a moment not about chimpanzee sort of behaviors, but very human behaviors. I'm mindful, and we talked about at the beginning, that you were a pioneer as a young woman working in this field in the early 1960s. I'm just looking back at some of the reporting at the time. The Associated Press, for example, began a report on what you were doing in Tanganyika with these words: a willowy blonde with more time for monkeys than men told today how she spent 15 months in the jungle to study the habits of apes. I mean, there's no way they'd have written about a male scientist like that.
Well, no, but it didn't bother me back then. Quite honestly, I just wanted to get on and study the chimpanzees. And when there were reports like, oh, well, Jane's only famous because of her legs, it was a different world, and women didn't feel as threatened then as they do today, because feminism, hadn't begun. This is just after World War II. And my feeling was at the time, that, well, if my legs have helped me to get onto the cover of the Geographic. Thank you, legs, because that's given me the opportunity to go on studying the chimpanzees, which is what I want to do. So, today would not be acceptable.
Let's reflect on where we are today. You referred to it early in the interview about the degree of pressure that there is on the communities of chimpanzees and so many other wild animals, particularly in Africa right now. I think the figures suggest that there are around 170,000 chimpanzees in the wild today, and at the turn of the 20th century it's believed there were more than 1 million. Do you think we humans have completely failed chimpanzees and so many other species?
Well, we're certainly failing them, but in the same way we're failing our own future generations of human beings. We've been for a long time stealing the future of our children, grandchildren. We're still stealing it today. We have terribly harmed this planet. This has led to the climate crisis, which, if we don't get together around the world and do something about it soon, will lead to the end of life on this planet as we know it, and that includes us. It's our disrespect of nature, of the natural world and of animals that's led to this pandemic, this COVID-19 pandemic, and it's led to climate change. And so, this is why I left Gombe, which the best days of my life were there, out in the rainforest, learning about the interconnection of all living things, how each species has a role to play in this wonderful web of life, which we call biodiversity. And learning as I traveled around the world, raising awareness about what was going on in Africa, about what we're doing to the planet. And we won't go into that now, but I think probably everybody listening knows what we're doing to the planet.
But I think, if I may, I think it is important to ask you this simple question. Thinking of Gombe in Tanzania, where you did so much work, and so many other places in Africa, what would you say to those perhaps local people who would say, well, Jane Goodall, her work is amazing, but let us not forget Jane Goodall is a white woman with a lot of privilege coming into our communities and now telling us that we must not deforest, we must not seek out bushmeat, which we can sell in the marketplace to feed our families and keep our families alive. She's lecturing us in a way which doesn't reflect the hardships and realities of our daily lives. And therefore, her message about conservation is not one that we can easily accept.
Well, what I would say to that is that's never what I did. And when I realized in 1986 that the forests across Africa were going and that chimpanzees were decreasing in number along with other animals, the first thing I felt was important was to find out more about it. So I scraped together a bit of money and managed to visit, I think it was 6 range countries where chimpanzees lived, where they were being studied by then. And what I learned about was, yes, the plight of the chimps, but also the plight of so many of the African people living in and around chimpanzee habitat. And it came to a head when I flew over the tiny Gombe National Park, which, as I've said, was by 1990, it was just a small island of forest surrounded by completely bare hills. People struggling to survive, too poor to buy food from elsewhere. And that's when it hit me. If we don't do something to help these people find ways of making a living without destroying the environment, we can't even try to save the chimpanzees. And so the Jane Goodall Institute began our community-based conservation program, which we called Takari. And it was very holistic, and it wasn't a group of arrogant white people marching into the villages and telling people, you've messed things up, this is what we're going to do to make things better for you. No, it was a small group, I think it was 7 local Tanzanians. They didn't even have a degree, so they weren't threatening, and they were handpicked. And they went into the villages and sat down with the people and asked them, what do you think we could do to help you? And that's where we began. Better education for the children, restoring fertility to the overused land to grow more food, and better health care. So we started in that way with just the 12 villages and a tiny grant from the European Union.
And I've looked at the amount of work that your institute has done, along with other organisations you've set up, like the Roots and Shoots organisation, particularly focused on young people in communities. You've done extraordinary work, but it seems to me the more you've turned from research to activism, and you travel all over the world with this message, the more uphill the struggle seems to be. Are you feeling, in your 9th decade, very bleak about where we are?
Well, first of all, I mean, you know this expression, think globally, act locally. Don't, because if you think globally, you're so depressed. You can't help it today. But if you think, now what can I do as an individual right here in my own community? This is the premise behind our Roots and Shoots program that I began in '91 with 12 high school students in Tanzania. And it basically was telling them that, you know, what they did each day would make a difference. And so it started with these 12 high school students. It's now in 65 countries. We have kindergarten members, university members, everything in between. And that's my hope for the future, because everywhere where I was going when I could travel, I haven't been able to travel because of this silly pandemic, but there were children and students coming up. Dr. Jane, we want to tell you what we've been doing to make this a better world. So enthusiastic.
Jane, a last question. Over your left shoulder, I see beautiful pictures of some of the chimpanzees who were part of your studies. Do you think chimpanzees have a future? There are people who talk about the real possibility of the extinction of wild chimpanzees.
Well, it's what I'm going to fight for the rest of my life. I don't know how long that is. But we have got some quite large areas, and because of this Tokari program that I told you about, I talked about the bare hills around Gombe. Fly over it today, you won't see any bare hills. The forests have been allowed to come back. The villagers have become our partners in conservation, and they understand that protecting the environment isn't just for wildlife, it's their own future. They need the forests for clean air, clean water, to regulate rainfall and climate. And that program is now in 6 other African countries where JGI is studying chimpanzees. So there are large areas of forest, and the villagers are beginning to leave corridors where the chimps can move from one community to another, which they must do to avoid inbreeding. So I have great hope but we don't have long to do it. And seeking funding, you know, Gombe 60 this year, 60th anniversary, we were going to use it, we were going to have galas all around and raise lots of money, but of course that's all put on hold because of COVID-19. But nevertheless, I do have hope because of the young people, because of this brain that's coming up now, finally, with ways of living in greater harmony with nature, because of the resilience of nature, give it a chance, it comes back, and because of what I call the indomitable human spirit, the people who tackle what seems impossible and won't give up, and very often succeed.
I have to say, that is a wonderful and uplifting note upon which to end. Jane Goodall, I thank you very much indeed for being with me on Hard Talk.
Well, thank you too. It's a stimulating conversation. Thank you.